They told me it was a shortcut, that if I followed them I'd get there faster. But what they didn't tell me was I'd never go home the same way again. I was 14, too old to believe in monsters under the bed, but still young enough to trust the wrong people. It was late spring, one of those afternoons that carried a warmth that made your guard drop. I had just finished track practice and missed my bus. My phone was nearly dead. No way to call my parents. That's when they approached me, two older teens I vaguely recognized from school. One of them had a busted skateboard. The other was eating sunflower seeds and spitting shells into a torn paper bag. "You live near Oak Ridge, right?" they asked. "We're headed that way too. We know a path through the lots behind the shopping plaza. Saves you half an hour." They seemed casual, friendly even. And in that moment, what I feared most wasn't danger, it was being alone. Being stranded. Being seen walking home while everyone else rode past in cars or on bikes. So I nodded, slung my backpack higher, and followed. We cut behind the auto repair shop, down a slope cluttered with broken glass and tire tracks. The shortcut quickly turned into a maze of overgrown weeds, graffiti-covered storage units, and fences lined with bent shopping carts. I kept thinking we'd pop out near the donut shop on Marlin Avenue. Instead, we just kept going, and going, until I couldn't even hear the traffic anymore. That's when I noticed we weren't walking in the direction of Oak Ridge. And that was the last moment I would feel safe for weeks. I don't know if you've ever had the sensation of time bending, of your mind screaming this isn't right while your body keeps going, too stunned to resist. That was me, until they stopped. One grabbed my backpack. The other turned to face me, no longer chewing seeds, no longer smiling. What followed wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like the crime shows or YouTube reenactments. It was subtle, quiet, chilling in its normalcy. "Get in," he said, pointing toward a rust-covered hatchback half buried behind a shipping container. I froze. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, just waited like I was supposed to know the rules and obey. When I didn't move fast enough, the one behind me shoved. Not hard, but hard enough. The interior of that car smelled like gasoline and mildew. I saw duct tape on the floor, a stained hoodie, a crumpled McDonald's wrapper with dried ketchup. I could barely breathe. They didn't blindfold me. That part still puzzles me. It's like they wanted me to see the roads, to know how far I was being taken. Maybe they thought it would make me feel hopeless. If so, it worked. We drove for what felt like hours, though later I'd learn it was less than 45 minutes. We ended up in a cabin. Not the kind with lake views or log furniture. This one was gutted, abandoned, its windows boarded, and the air stale. I remember the walls, covered in marker scribbles and old concert posters that hung by single nails. It was like someone tried to make it feel normal once and then gave up. The older guy, the one with the sunflower seeds, seemed to be in charge. He called the other one Bear. I never heard his real name. Bear didn't talk much, just did whatever he was told. The first night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I was terrified they'd hurt me. But they didn't. Not that night. They gave me a mattress, thin, dusty, probably moldy, and a warm bottle of orange soda. I drank it anyway. My throat was dry from crying. They didn't ask for ransom. Didn't try to contact my family. They just kept me. Like I was a forgotten object they'd picked up and stashed away. At first, I kept track of days by counting meals. 2 per day, usually canned beans, instant noodles, crackers. But after a week, I started losing count. My watch had been taken. The boarded windows let in only slivers of light. Time dissolved. So did hope. But here's the part no one tells you about being kidnapped. Not every captor acts like a monster. Sometimes they act like people. And that's what messes with your head. Sunflower seed guy, who I later learned went by Chris, started asking me questions. About school. About movies. About music. He told me he once wanted to be a DJ. That he dropped out of high school and regretted it. He said I reminded him of his little sister. It was confusing. Horrifying, yes. But confusing too. Because part of me started playing along. Laughing at jokes. Answering questions. Anything to stay alive. Stockholm Syndrome isn't something that happens overnight. It's like mold in a damp basement. It grows slowly. Invisibly. Until you realize you're no longer just surviving, you're adapting. Bear was different. He never hit me. But he was quiet, unpredictable. One day he gave me a comic book. The next, he snapped when I looked at the TV too long. I learned to read the room. To stay invisible. Eventually, I stopped crying. I stopped trying to run. I stopped imagining rescue. My world became those 2 rooms. That mattress. The smell of beans. the click of the space heater when it turned off. I even forgot what month it was. But everything changed the day I heard the radio. It was low, faint, coming from another room. I hadn't heard a radio since I'd been taken. I pressed my ear to the wall. Static, then music, then a news bulletin. Missing teen believed abducted in the Northeast metro area. Parents urge anyone with information to come forward. My name. They said my name. Something inside me snapped. All the numbness vanished. I was real again. Alive. Out there, the world hadn't forgotten me. And that's when the planning began. I won't lie. It wasn't clever. It wasn't like a movie where I built a trap out of scrap metal and escaped in the night. It started with something small. A pencil. I found it behind the couch when Bear wasn't watching. I tucked it under the mattress. Not as a weapon, just as something that was mine. That night, I didn't sleep again. I replayed that news report over and over in my head. Someone out there was still looking. That meant there was still a way out. The opportunity came 3 days later. Chris had gone out. Bear was watching TV. I asked to use the bathroom. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that I didn't close the door. The moment I heard him shift his weight toward the hallway, I ran. Bare feet slapping against old linoleum. I didn't scream. I didn't look back. I just ran. Through the front door. Down the porch steps. Into the woods. Branches slapped my arms. My lungs burned. I ran like a wild animal. I didn't even know where I was going. Just away. Farther. Faster. Then headlights. I stumbled onto a gravel road and nearly collapsed in front of a pickup truck. The driver slammed the brakes and jumped out shouting. I remember gasping one word, help. After that, everything was fast. Sirens. Questions. A blanket over my shoulders. Flashing lights. My parents. Tears. They caught Chris and Bear that same night. Turns out, I wasn't the first person they tried to lure. But I was the only one who had vanished completely. In the aftermath, the news painted me as brave. Survivors always get called that. But here's the truth, bravery isn't something you feel. It's what you do when you have no other option. I spent the next year in therapy. I didn't want to talk about it at first. I didn't want to think about it. But slowly, I started unpacking it all. The fear. The confusion. The tiny victories that kept me going. Today, I can walk alone again. I can ride the bus. I can sleep through the night. Not always, but most nights. And when people ask how I survived, I tell them the truth. I remembered that I mattered. Even when they tried to make me feel like I didn't. Even when my world shrunk to a mattress and 2 cans of beans a day. I held onto the idea that somewhere out there, someone still cared. And that idea saved me. After the news crews packed up and the social media hashtags died down, the real recovery began, and it wasn't pretty. Most people think once you're rescued, the nightmare ends. But that's not true. Rescue is just the beginning of a new kind of fear. One where the danger isn't outside anymore. It's inside you. In the way you jump when someone knocks on the door. In the way you flinch when your phone rings from an unknown number. In the way your body tenses whenever someone says your name too loudly. I was put on a home study program for the rest of that school year. My parents were supportive, but I could see the fear in their eyes too. They tiptoed around me like I was made of glass. My little brother didn't understand. He asked if the bad guys were going to come to our house now. That night, he slept on the floor in my room with a flashlight in his hand. I started seeing a trauma therapist twice a week. Her name was Marlene, and she had this calm voice that made you feel like she already knew what you were about to say. At first, I said almost nothing. I just sat in the chair and stared at the bookcases full of psychology manuals and tissues. But every week, she gave me space. And when I was ready, I began talking. I told her about the soda, the mattress, the pencil, the comic book Bear gave me. The way Chris once said I had old eyes. All these fragments that made no sense to anyone else, but to me, they were chapters in a story I didn't want to carry alone anymore. One of the hardest things to admit was that sometimes I missed the routine. Not the fear. Not the captors. Just the certainty. Wake up. Eat. Sit. Sleep. It was a simple rhythm. Traumatizing, yes, but oddly consistent. Now I was back in a world that moved fast. That expected things from me. That kept asking, "Are you okay?" when I clearly wasn't. The hardest day was my first trip back to school. I walked down the hall and every head turned. Whispers followed me like smoke. Some kids looked scared of me. Others looked curious. One kid, who'd always been kind before, asked, "Did they, torture you?" I didn't answer. I just walked past him and locked myself in a bathroom stall until lunch ended. It was easier to be alone. for a while. But then something happened I didn't expect. A girl named Jules, who I'd never spoken to before, came up to me during study period and handed me a folded note. No words. Just a tiny drawing of a lighthouse and the phrase, "You're not broken. You're a survivor." That was the first time I cried in front of someone who wasn't a therapist. Jules didn't push me to talk. She just sat next to me in the library every Thursday. We didn't say much, but she was there, and that mattered more than any speech or sympathy card. Later, I found out her cousin had gone missing for 3 days the year before. She was found safe, but the damage lingered. Jules knew what it felt like to live in the after. The most frustrating part was how people treated my story like entertainment. The local paper wrote 3 articles about me. One of them included details I never gave anyone. Another spelled my name wrong. YouTubers started making true crime videos with my face in the thumbnail and titles like "Chilling Teen Abduction You Won't Believe." Believe me, I wanted to forget. But now my name was out there, forever tied to the worst thing that ever happened to me. First, I was angry, then numb. Then I decided if people were going to hear my story, they'd hear it from me. So I started writing. Not for clicks, not for sympathy, but because my memories were like knots in a rope, and writing helped untangle them. At night, I'd sit at my desk with the lamp on and scribble down pieces of it all. How the floor creaked outside my door at night. How Bear once brought me a candy bar after I cried. How Chris sometimes spoke like he truly believed what he was doing wasn't wrong. I didn't excuse them, but I stopped seeing them as villains in a horror movie. They were broken people who chose evil paths. Not ghosts, not shadows, just humans. And that realization was both terrifying and weirdly empowering. Because if evil can look that normal, then maybe recovery could too. It wasn't long before my writing became something more. I started a blog under a fake name, just a place to process. At first, it had no readers. Then a few. Then a dozen. Then dozens. Survivors. Strangers. People who told me, "Your words helped me feel seen." That gave me purpose again. Not the kind you win trophies for, but the kind that keeps you breathing when the nightmares try to suffocate you. One night, I got an email that stopped me cold. It was from someone who said they'd been approached by Chris and Bear 2 months before I was taken. He said they offered him a ride when his car broke down. Said he got a weird vibe and declined. When he saw my story online, he realized how close he came to vanishing too. He ended his message with, "I don't know if this helps, but your story saved my life." That was the first time I believed something good could come from what happened to me. I started volunteering at a youth center. Not to give speeches or tell war stories, but just to be around kids who needed a safe space. I helped with homework, set up art supplies, cleaned out old board games. One afternoon, a 10-year-old girl asked if I'd read her story about a dragon who saves a kidnapped prince. I said yes, and I meant it. Therapy continued. The panic attacks got fewer. The dreams less violent. I still had triggers, sirens, certain colognes, the smell of beans, but they no longer controlled me. 1 year after my escape, I lit a candle at the edge of the woods near my house. I didn't say a prayer. I didn't make a speech. I just stood there, breathing, grounded, alive. And that's when I realized survival isn't just escaping the moment. It's choosing to keep living long after the moment has passed. It's waking up every day and refusing to be defined by your worst experience. It's remembering who you are when the world tried to make you forget. So if you're watching this and wondering how someone can make it through something so dark, know this: you already have the light inside you. Sometimes it just takes getting lost to find it. Healing isn't a straight road. It's a jagged, twisting path full of unexpected detours. And some days, it feels like you're walking in circles. I wish I could say I came out of that cabin fearless and unshakable. But the truth is, fear lingered. It followed me like a quiet shadow, especially when I least expected it. Loud footsteps behind me in a parking lot. A car idling too long outside my house. Strangers who looked a little too long in my direction. I had to reteach my body that not everything was danger. That not every noise meant someone was coming for me. But the brain doesn't forget trauma. It just buries it until something brings it up again. Sometimes that something was small, like a particular song, or a commercial for orange soda. Other times it was big, like testifying in court. Yes, I testified. That moment was something I struggled with for months. My parents and therapists made it clear I didn't have to. The prosecutors had enough evidence. But deep down I knew I needed to look them in the eye, not for them, but for me. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Sterile. Unemotional. Chris sat at the defense table in a cheap suit. Bear barely looked up. They both looked smaller than I remembered. Less powerful. Just two broken people trying to pretend they weren't monsters. I wore a simple dress. One I picked out myself. I wanted to feel strong. Not flashy. Not scared. When they asked me to take the stand, I could barely feel my legs move. But my voice didn't shake. I told them everything. From the moment I followed them behind the auto shop to the moment I ran into the headlights on that gravel road. I didn't cry. Not once. Not until I sat back down next to my parents and saw my mom squeeze my dad's hand so hard his knuckles turned white. Afterward, the prosecutor said something I'll never forget. You were their prisoner. But today you were your own rescuer. Both Chris and Bear were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. That should have been the end. The final chapter. But closure isn't always clean. It's not about you tie and walk away from. It's a door you learn to keep closed without checking the lock every 5 minutes. Some people told me I was lucky. I used to nod and say thanks. But inside, the word didn't sit right. Lucky would have been never getting in that car. Lucky would have been catching the bus that day. I wasn't lucky, I was resilient. And that's a word I've come to embrace. There was one night, almost a year and a half later, that really changed things. I was walking home from a late study group. I had my backpack slung over one shoulder, headphones in, and it was just starting to drizzle. I took a side street, a shortcut, ironically, and for a split second I felt that same flicker of dread from years earlier. But this time I didn't freeze. I stopped, took a deep breath, looked around, and kept walking. That moment meant everything. Not because I proved I was brave, but because I proved I was free. It's easy to think trauma defines you, that your past becomes your identity. But I've learned something powerful. Survival is an act of rebellion. A daily, conscious choice to keep showing up, to keep laughing, to keep building a life that belongs to you. I started speaking at schools under a pseudonym. At first, I just shared safety tips. How to recognize manipulation. How to trust your gut. But then students started coming up to me after each talk, saying things like, "That happened to my cousin," or something like "That almost happened to me." And then one girl, tiny voice, huge eyes, said, "I never told anyone until now." That's when I realized these weren't just stories. These were life preservers. Every time I spoke, I was handing someone a tool, a truth, a thread of hope. Eventually, I dropped the pseudonym. I used my real name. The first time I did, I felt the weight of it. The fear. The possibility that someone might use it against me again. But then I remembered, people already had. And I was still standing. People say that trauma makes you stronger. I disagree. Trauma breaks you. But healing. That's where the strength comes from. From rebuilding. Reclaiming. Reimagining who you are and what your life can be. I started keeping a box. Not a memory box, more like a reminder box. Inside it are little objects that mark moments of growth. A pebble from the woods I ran through. A copy of that comic book Bear gave me. A ticket stub from my first movie night out after everything happened. A sticky note from Jules that says, "Still here. Still whole." Each item is a piece of proof that I made it. That I'm still making it. There are still bad days. There always will be. Days when the news shows another case. Days when I wake up from dreams that feel too real. Days when a strange event slows down near me and my heart starts sprinting before my feet do. But those days don't own me anymore. I've also learned to laugh again. Not polite laughter, real, belly laughter that makes your sides hurt. The kind that reminds you that joy is a form of resistance. I got a dog. His name is Rook. He's part lab, part chaos. He doesn't know anything about my past. To him, I'm just the human who gives him treats and lets him steal half the bed. But when I curl up next to him at night and hear his calm breathing, I remember what safety feels like. Not the kind someone gives you. The kind you build yourself. People often ask what they should teach their kids about safety. I tell them, teach them to trust their instincts. To speak up even when it's hard. And above all, to know they are never to blame for someone else's cruelty. Because shame is a heavy chain. It keeps survivors from speaking. It keeps us from healing. And it kept me silent for too long. But not anymore. Every time I share my story, it becomes less about what happened to me and more about what I chose to do after. And if you're watching this wondering if your voice matters, if your pain can ever be turned into something meaningful, I'm here to tell you, yes. Absolutely. Unequivocally. It can. So speak. Right? Scream if you have to. But don't stay silent. Because silence is what predators count on. And your voice, it's the one thing they can never steal. The older I get, the more I understand how survival shapes you, not just in scars or stories, but in how you see the world. It's in the way I double-check locks without thinking, in how I memorize exits every time I enter a room, in the way my heartbeat picks up when someone walks too close behind me. But it's also in my strength, my empathy, my refusal to look away when someone else is suffering. People think trauma weakens you. What they don't see is how sharp it makes your instincts, how deeply it tunes you to the emotions of others, how it teaches you to find meaning in the smallest signs of safety. A light left on in the hallway, a friend who checks in without asking why, a dog curled beside your feet at night. For a long time, I thought the story of my life would always begin with that one terrible day. But I've learned something more important. That day is not my origin. It's just a page. Not the first, not the last. There was a time when all I wanted was to forget. Now, I want to remember, but on my terms. I remember the people who helped me, even when they didn't know how. The neighbor who left a note on our porch after I came home that said, "If you ever need to scream, my backyard is always empty." The substitute teacher who didn't ask questions when I skipped every assignment and just gave me a quiet place to sit. Jules, who never asked for the whole story, just offered me her company like a shield. And I remember the girl I was before. She wasn't naive. She wasn't stupid. She was kind, open, trusting. The world hurt her for those things, but I refused to believe those traits were weaknesses. They were her strengths. And they're mine too. I still write. I still speak. But now I also listen. To survivors who whisper their stories through clenched teeth. To parents who live with the terror of what if. To the kids who sit in the back of the room holding their breath, hoping someone will say what they're afraid to admit. To anyone listening right now, if you've ever felt unsafe, unseen, unheard, know this. You deserve safety. You deserve support. You deserve the right to take up space without apology. Your fear is valid, but it does not get to decide the rest of your life. Every survivor I've met, every story I've read, has one thing in common, a moment where they chose to keep going. That moment doesn't have to be dramatic. Can be quiet, small, like standing up, like telling someone, like breathing through one more panic attack and saying, "Not today." If you've made it this far into my story, thank you. Thank you for witnessing it, for holding space for a truth that is hard, but important. Stories like mine aren't just horror stories. They're human stories, and the more we share them, the less power darkness has. Please, if you feel moved, tell someone you trust. Comment below. Start a conversation. Let's normalize listening to survivors instead of sensationalizing their pain. Let's stop asking, why didn't they leave, and start asking, what stopped them, and how can we break that? Let's stop treating survival as an individual miracle and start treating safety as a shared responsibility. You never know whose life you might change just by believing them. So I'll leave you with this. I was taken, but I came back stronger. Not because I was fearless, but because I chose to fight for a future that was still mine. And now I live it every day with purpose, with courage, and without apology.